The longer that I've looked at it, the more I'm actually impressed by it. I don't know where to go from this. He really does have some bizarre art, and I don't mean that as a pun. He's just an illustrator without animation training who can animate better than most animators. He's just that good. Here's the Jot Notes version of this series if you've never seen an episode before. It's kind of like a ripoff of Corridor Crew and LegalEagle's React videos, but with a focus on illustration and looking at comic art from some top-tier professionals to learn what they're doing right in some of their best art and learn what is occasionally going wrong in some of their less than stellar art. I'm Christian Pearson. I've been a professional illustrator and animator for about 7 years now, and while I'm nowhere near the skill level of most of the artists that I talk about on this show, people seem to be finding my analysis and breakdown of their work to be pretty interesting, so looks like I'm gonna keep doing it. And yes, as much requested, I look at some manga art later in this episode. Let's get into the first piece of art. I mean, it is pretty weird looking. I found this image framed by a lot of people as being some of the worst professional Spider-Man art that they've seen, and when I looked at it, I didn't quite think that far. I did think it was weird looking, but with this one, the longer that I've looked at it, the more I'm actually impressed by it. With comic art, one of the first things that people will look at to judge if it's good or bad is anatomy, because that's a big part of superhero comics. It's easy to look at just the anatomy of this one and say, ooh, that's gross. But what I think is kind of important to do with this one is look at what the anatomy is doing. Even though it's stretched and warped, it's doing that in a way where it's helping accent the movement. This almost looks like a smear frame from an animation, which is a frame of animation that acts kind of like motion blur. If you look at it on its own as a still frame, it looks pretty unusual, but when you see it in movement, in the animation, it makes the whole movement feel more smooth and fluid. But obviously this is a comic, and we are supposed to look at this as a still frame. I mean, I flipped through the comic that this is from, and I don't think I would want to read a whole comic in this art style, but I really respect the skills that have gone into making this image. I definitely would not call it bad art. Just even look at the composition itself. The way that Lady Stiltman's leg is really helping sell the trail that your eye is supposed to go down. Presumably your eye would start up in that first Spider-Man panel of just his head, and then go down onto Lady Stiltman's hair, follow down through her leg to Spider-Man's body, go up through his body to where the webbing and his leg and her leg meet, and come up the rest of the way, and it's just such a fluid, movement-filled piece, and everything in it, including the wonky anatomy, is helping sell that movement. But, to be fair, you don't need to warp anatomy to make something really look like it's moving. This frame is gorgeous. I want a poster of this frame. It's just so beautiful, and it feels like a paused moment during the action beat of a movie. You can really feel the movement, and what I also find really cool about this one is he's good at making the different levels of movement be felt. For instance, Captain America's shield is moving a lot faster than Captain America because he's just whipped it at Absorbing Man, and he's jumping to the side, but he doesn't have as much of a blur to him because he's moving a bit slower than the shield would be moving. And the fastest moving thing is Absorbing Man's Wrecking Ball, which that impact you can really feel, and it's got the most sort of blur to it and on its chain, and I love how angular the chain is, and I've seen few artists that can sell motion better than Dexter Soy. He's so good at it. And this is kind of a side note, but something I found really interesting about his work, I saw this video of him working, and he actually uses an Intuos style tablet. When I think of most professional comic book artists, a lot of the time I imagine them either working traditionally or on a screen like this, where you actually draw on the screen. But he has the kind of tablet where you're drawing on the tablet on the table and looking at the screen. I don't mean to bash anyone using Intuos tablets. You can make just as fantastic artwork with them. I just thought it was kind of interesting. Dan Mora Chaves is just phenomenal. If you've watched the previous episodes, you probably know exactly what I want to say about how the snake is guiding our eye through the image, because it really takes you down to the snowman, makes you look at this awesome axe over Claus, who's the main character of this series, and then up to the snake. And as the snake's body is going through, it's getting more saturated and vibrant red, and it's got such an awesome head design. And I love how its body not only is guiding us through the image, but is also framing a lot of stuff in the image. Like, the snake's body is even framing its own head. And to help sell the framing even more, the moon, that's got a bit of a ring around it. I guess it's probably not the moon. I haven't read this issue. But that planet in the background is even help framing the characters. So I've talked before about how a lot of industry professionals, when they're doing a comic for Marvel or DC or whoever, they'll do the penciling and then someone else will do the inking and coloring, or maybe just the coloring or whatever else. There's usually a team of people. With Dan Mora's work on Claws, he was doing everything, and that is, personally, I think, him at his peak. One of the shots is just burned into my head. It's a big sweeping shot of Claws looking out over this town, and the buildings are nicely rendered, and everything is just beautiful. It's one of my favorite in-comic panels I've seen. I've read his work on Power Rangers as well, and in that he's just doing the penciling, and Raul Angelo is doing the coloring for him, and that looks really great as well. But when Dan Mora is coloring his own work, and this is me being very biased because he's one of my favorite artists, but I think some of his work on Claws is just unbeatably fantastic. Okay, now we're gonna move on to some manga, and while there is a ton of really fantastic art and artists that we're gonna look at in this section, I feel like I have to start with, by far, the weirdest art thing I've ever had to research. I don't know which one I should start with. A lot of these I feel like I don't really need to say too much, right? I mean, you can see the giant hands, tiny heads, really long legs, sometimes kind of wonky perspective. These images are from different artists in the same genre. I was recommended this genre by a bunch of people in the last video. It's called Yaoi, and I was told that it had some really weird anatomy. I was told to just Google Yaoi anatomy. And I was warned that there might be some not safe for work stuff in there. I'm just gonna show the PG stuff. But basically, Yaoi is a romance genre, specifically for romance stories between men, but it's a genre that's targeted at women and written and illustrated by women. Which sounds like a very niche thing, but I guess it's big enough that there's a whole genre based around it. And so much of the art in this genre has such weird looking anatomy. But the thing is, it seems so consistently weird between a bunch of different artists, all working in this one genre, all doing the same kinds of weird giant hands and sometimes really big lips. So I thought, okay, maybe this is just a part of this genre. It's part of the visual language of these kinds of stories, and I just don't get it. So to test that theory, I went and looked up some of the most popular manga in this genre. So I looked at some art from a series called Like a Beast and from a series called Escape Journey, but the thing is, in those stories, the anatomy all looks like pretty normal manga art. The anatomy's all fine. So that, I don't know if that blows my theory out of the water, and I was literally just Googling, why is yaoi anatomy so weird, and the only answers I was finding were people's theories that it's just a lot of bad artists. I don't know where to go from this. I honestly just think it's kind of fascinating, and I wish I had some answers. So if you're a fan of yaoi and you know why so much of the art has these crazy giant hands and weird proportions and stuff, please let me know in the comments, because I am incredibly curious. I am very, very skeptical to think that it's just a bunch of bad artists working in this genre. It's too consistent for that, so please, somebody tell me what's up. Let's just move on to something that I can wrap my head around a little bit more. I love how high contrast this main character is against that background. And with all the trees kind of pointing in, like, look at this guy. It's a high level of detail over the whole thing. And I love how Kentaro Miura managed to make this creature very detailed, but also keep him very obscured. Now, I haven't read Berserk. It looks really fantastic, and I might have to start reading it, but I'm assuming that the characters haven't seen this creature in full yet, or at least that Kentaro Miura wants to keep it obscured just to make it more menacing looking. But if it was just kind of solid black, it might not fit in with how detailed and rendered out everything else is. So a good way that he's kept the creature detailed is just drawing lots of streaky lines on it, which not only helps obscure it and keep it looking more menacing and in the dark, but it also helps emphasize the movement on the character because it's really flying forward, and framing it the way it's framed, if it didn't have something like that, it could end up looking like it's just stuck there with no movement to it. So that was a really smart idea. Hear me out on this. When I first looked at this image, my eye started in the upper left, went down the wing, and stopped on that high contrast point near the head of the creature, and I just stared at the creature. And for the first few seconds I was looking at it, I didn't even realize that there were characters down here. But keep in mind that the target audience for this series, or at least the initial target audience, is Japanese. And so if you were raised Japanese or in any kind of language that reads from right to left, you're inherently more likely when looking at an image to start on the right side of the page. And the writing here, presumably being in Japanese, registers immediately as language that you can read, whereas to me, I don't read Japanese, so it kind of fades a little bit more into the trees. If it was English writing, my eyes probably would have gone there quicker. So those two things combined would mean that a Japanese audience is more likely to start in the upper right, read down these words, look at the characters in the bottom corner, and then they're all looking up at this creature, so your eye would go up there and then stop on the beast. So basically I'm just saying a Japanese audience is more likely to read this image in the order that the artist intended. Although, I guess to be fair, if I was reading this image in the context of the manga, because you read manga right to left, I would be more likely to look at the image properly, even though I was raised reading in the other direction. So that kind of negates my point, but for artists, that's still a good thing to keep in mind if you're making solo image work, like a poster or a painting or something like that. That sort of idea of people reading an image in different directions is one of the reasons that artists early in their career or schooling are encouraged to flip their artwork. So either looking at your art in a mirror, or if you're working digitally, just flip the canvas, because then you're kind of looking at the character in a different way and you're more likely to catch some of your mistakes. But yeah, this page right here is some of the coolest manga art I think I've seen. I really love it. I mean, this is just incredible. And to clarify what you're looking at, these are both sets of panels drawn by Yusuke Murata for the One Punch Man manga. And people have taken the panels out and put them in order as an animated looping GIF. But what's even more mind-blowing about there just being animations that work inside a manga, if you take them out and put them frame by frame, they're all spinning camera move shots. This is the hardest kind of thing to animate. Even in the 90s, when 3D started becoming a little bit more viable, Disney would use 3D environments so that they wouldn't have to animate big sweeping camera movements, because then you have to draw the environment in every single frame, but if you 3D animate it, you just have to draw the characters, which takes a lot less time. And here he is doing it in a comic where people aren't necessarily going to get to appreciate that his work just works as an animation. And I went looking to see if he had some kind of animation background, and he doesn't. He's just an illustrator without animation training who can animate better than most animators. It's crazy how incredible his spatial awareness is, because he also wouldn't be able to look at these frame by frame. Usually an animator doing frame by frame animation will be able to flip on a light table or something between their previous shots, but if he's doing these on a comic page, one after the other, he can't do that. And he wouldn't have been making this thinking that people were gonna test him on it and take these out and put them frame by frame. So he didn't need to make them work perfectly for an animation, but they just do. He's just that good. That is just next level stuff. The colors on this piece are just wild. It's all so vibrant, and it could almost become chaotic if it wasn't for the fact that he keeps our focus by having a big pink triangle through the image, going from the ground up into this biggest character who's mostly in a pink outfit. There's so many weird things in this image, and there are things that looking at it from a different artist in a different image, I would almost want to call mistakes, but because it's Hirohiko Araki and he kind of leans into this weirdness, it just feels like it works. For instance, if you look at this character that's largely yellow, he's very clearly in front of this tree, but leaning back as if he's leaning on it. And then it's also just an unusual choice having these three characters going from small to bigger to biggest when they're all on a similar sort of plane. But I guess that also does kind of help emphasize the triangle. And I love the texture of these clouds is so weird. They all kind of look like, I don't know, squids or big clumps of whipped cream that have gotten a little bit crusted. It's so bizarre, but so hard to look away from. And then I love these horses. The level of detail on them is so well chosen. And I looked through a bunch of the interiors from Steel Ball Run, and they were really great. I just had more interesting stuff to say about the covers. And one thing I noticed was how fantastic he is at horse anatomy. The horses were just so well rendered, and what I think he does a great job with, as mentioned on this cover, is deciding how much detail to use on them when they're going farther into the background. And that's something every artist has to kind of learn how to do, especially when making a comic, is deciding the amount of detail on something in relation to how close it is to us. A really good thing to look at in Western comics for this is Spider-Man. A lot of the time the artist has to decide, okay, is Spider-Man far enough away from us and small enough in this panel that we shouldn't draw his webbing on him? Because that's a detail that A, you wouldn't really be able to see in real life from a distance, and B, can be too distracting if you add that extra level of detail to a character that's really far back. He really does have some bizarre art, and I don't mean that as a pun. It really is just some bizarre work. But I'm starting to get why JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has so many hardcore fans. Alright everybody, that's all for this episode. There's so many more artists that I'd love to talk about. Tons have been recommended. I love the enthusiasm. Leave more suggestions in the comments below, whether Western or manga or whatever. I'm thinking of making this a series that I'll do once every 2 weeks or so, at least, until people get sick of it. Also, one correction from the last episode, but apparently Salvador LaRocca did that Iron Man meme image. All the other images I talked about when talking about Greg Land were his, but that one might actually be Salvador LaRocca. I haven't been able to 100% confirm that. I looked through a bunch of both of their comics that they've done Iron Man in, and I couldn't quite find it. If anyone does find it, I'll make sure to put it in the pinned comment in the description of that episode. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to check out some of my other videos, my animations and illustration videos. I've got tutorials, I've got weird mashups. Anyway, I'm Christian Pearson. This is Popcrest Studios, home of the nerdiest art videos on YouTube. Monday is part 2 of this month's community redraw episode, so I'll see a bunch of you there. Goodbye, everybody.